So mobility and migration shaped the European Bronze Age. An increasing connectivity between people and communities led to innovation, knowledge exchange, and resource acquisition that we have been able to trace archaeologically throughout the continent for decades. But only in recent years, bioarchaeological approaches made it possible to link mobility to the remains of specific gendered persons. Gender and mobility intersect at many levels, as part of the personal experience and identity formation, and in terms of social structure and demography. As we know that gender is an important factor in migration processes, from causes to consequences, and shapes every part of a person's migration experience. So the reasons for personal mobility, be it to find a partner, better conditions to raise a family, or respond to crisis and climate change, are very closely bound to gender roles and expectations. Relationships and power dynamics within communities, as well as access to networks beyond the immediate life worlds, are frequently structured along gendered lines. Risks, challenges, and opportunities on the move and during integration at the destination likewise vary according to age and gender. So once upon a time, we imagined that men were primarily on the move in the Bronze Age, be it as warriors or ritual specialists, craftsmen, or traders. But recent isotope studies revealed unexpected patterns. Rather than men, the majority of individuals identified as non-locals in Bronze Age burial communities are women. And the high diversity of mitochondrial DNA lineages further suggests a wider diversity of women's genetic heritage than men's. The idea that exogamous marriage and patrilocal residence patterns were widespread in the Bronze Age is not new. Previously, it was based on the distribution of female costume compositions. And in this talk, I'll take the opportunity first to show you some local Bronze Age archaeology around Vienna, because I assume most of you have non-local strontium signals in your bones. And then I'll argue that Bronze Age mobility studies will benefit from a better understanding of how motherhood was organized. If we consider women's reproductive roles, both biologically and socially, we can investigate in more detail the role of female movement in shaping societies. At present, we are still at the very beginning of understanding the basics of Bronze Age motherhood. We know very little about the age at which women had their first children, about maternal mortality, about sibling spacing and the age of weaning, as well as the total number of children women had, despite these profound consequences of these variables on demographic development of societies. And we're surprisingly far from understanding family constellations, how many partners men or women had, how wealth and status of the Bronze Age elites translated into number of healthy offspring, how marriage and kinship networks operated. Even very subtle differences in reproductive success engineered by practices such as longer breastfeeding, more responsive childcare, or the help of grandparents may over time result in significant advantages of one group over another. So I'm trying to tackle some of these questions with examples of the case studies we worked at in the framework of my ESC project. I'm very well aware at this point that we are raising more questions than we answer. In my ESC project, we're investigating social responses to pregnancy, birth, and child-rearing practices in prehistoric societies and relate the social to the reproductive status of prehistoric women. We want to know if and how women's social status changed as they became mothers and how motherhood was conceptualized in the past. So taking a long-term history approach, we analyze changes in family structures and gender relations from the late Neolithic to the early Iron Ages in Central Europe. And we aim to develop an innovative bundle of methodologies to understand motherhood a little bit better. Women in the past are often imagined to go through exactly the same stages of life, from baby to girl, from mother to grandmother, and the transition to motherhood is thereby taken as a natural, normal, and inevitable process, which hasn't really invited much investigation. With the help of the ESC grant, we're trying to look at motherhood from a combined bioarchaeological and contextual perspective. So I'll start with the question, at what age did women become mothers? And this is a crucial bit of information, as the age of first motherhood has profound implications on maternal mortality, the total number of children a woman will have over the life course, and on gender relations. And one way to answer this question is to compile a list of all the pregnant women who died in European prehistory And by this I mean women buried with a fetus in the pelvic area or cremated together, because many women died at the first attempt of giving birth. And in the data set so far, we find quite a few pregnant teenagers in the early Bronze Age. So this is one example of a recently published case study of Unterhautzental. And this points to a quite young marital age. So if we indeed link the majority of women on the move to marriage and motherhood, we expect to see mobility in the teenage years and early adulthood. And I suspect that many of the individuals we see as sub-adults were indeed women of marriageable age. So for the interpretation of local and non-local signals, it's really important to work towards a better understanding of what age exactly the third molar represents in a given population. And Corinna Knipper has compiled excellent comparative data to demonstrate how widely this varies. So Simon Mays in 2018 gives an M3 animal mineralization age of 8.5 to 13.5 years, whereas Corinna Knipper does not see the process finished by the age 16. But the adolescent years are very significant for women's identities, and socially it's a very big difference if we are dealing with an 8-year-old or with a 16-year-old. And one aspect of how women's marital age is linked to mobility is the observation that in unstable political systems during conflict and war, women tend to be married younger, often to older partners that promise protection the birth family can no longer provide. So child marriage around Syrian refugees has recently been well documented and is addressed as a gender-specific challenge for female migrants. Early marriage prevents girls' education, limits their choices in life, and early motherhood carries medical risks for women and their babies. So it would be really interesting to know if conflicts and migration would also have lowered the marital age in prehistory, and it's perhaps something we can find out. In early Bronze Age burials of the Aunjatids group, burials of 2 or more people are common, and sometimes their connectedness is really staged through specific arrangements of the bodies in graves. So we now know that the children of Unterhautzental are likely to have been siblings that died together aged 2 and 6 because they have exactly the same haplotype. As far as potential couple relationships are concerned, it's interesting to note that the combination of a man with a woman who is a decade or more his junior seems very common. A man, woman, and buried were buried in this grave at Unterhautzental. The woman, aged 17 to 20 years, was buried here with a 35 to 40-year-old, perhaps even older individual, according to 2 cementium annulation analysis. Another example is Franzhausen 599, where an adult man was buried with 2 teenage women in one oak coffin. So south of the Danube, such multiple burials are relatively rare. And the individual in this group, however, followed a strictly gendered body orientation, with men placed on the left side with the head in the north, and women placed on the right side with the head towards the south. And according to some morphological traits, it appears that the girls or women were closely related, but the mitochondrial DNA results suggest at least no maternal relationship at all between the 3 individuals. And this is also just to show that this is Walter Parson from the Legal Medicine Department in Innsbruck, who we are working together with. And this grave could again point to a quite young marital age in the Bronze Age, and not necessarily to only one woman. A high maternal mortality makes it quite likely that men have children with another, often younger partner, but polygyny is definitely also an option that has to be taken seriously. For the early Bronze Age, we have so far not found any evidence that women were excluded from reproduction for any reason, but the opposite might be true for men. And I want to pick up on the discussion that Christian Christiansen started yesterday, that research on the modern Y chromosome data inferred a bottleneck of Y chromosome lineages after neolithization around 5000 to 3000 BC, in which it was claimed that 1 man reproduced for every 17 women. The most likely explanation is that some men could accumulate wealth and power, perhaps through male-to-male violent competition, which then translated into reproductive success. So further explanations include the formation of patrilineal king groups and intergroup competition among these groups. So the descendants of Genghis Khan still have lasting impact on the genetic composition throughout large regions of Asia, and so do the medieval Irish warlords on the modern Irish population. In modern recent history, as a global average, about 4 or 5 women reproduce for every man. And today some have argued that human evolution is actually over, as there is not much difference in individuals' lifespans and fecundity. But our most recent case study, Schleimbach, provides archaeological examples which could be interpreted as editing the male lineages out of the gene pool. So the double burial 30-31 included 2 men, one aged 27 to 30 and one aged 30 to 35 years. And funerary taphonomy suggests that they have actually, the bodies were actually bound together after death. And both had skull fractures, which likely led to their death. And the DNA analysis confirmed that these brothers in arms were indeed actually very closely related. They again share exactly the same mitochondrial haplotype. And Pit 60 contained the remains of a 27 to 35-year-old man with 3 children, aged 3 to 4, 8 to 9, and 12 to 14 years. And the older 2 might have been male. The 2 younger children again share the same haplotype and could have been siblings, whereas the older child and the man were not maternally related. So it wouldn't be surprising if the man was indeed the father of all children with 2 different female partners. And admixture analysis, as I understand, approaches sex differences in genetic diversity from full genome sequencing of aDNA. In how far this can contribute to clarify the extent of the female and male contribution in migration processes, I think is so far not quite clear. Goldberg et al.'s 2017 analysis of 20 early Neolithic and 16 late Neolithic Bronze Age human remains claimed that the population movements around 3000 BC from the steppes point to a male-biased migration with a ratio of 5 to 14 males for every female. But then there is a paper by Lasadis and Reich that contests this conclusion and suggests that rather than sex bias, it's a bias in the estimation of admixture proportions that explains these findings. And then there's another reply by Goldberg, but as an archaeologist, I find it very difficult to make up my mind, because one lab claims this, the other lab claims this, and I have no idea how to statistically analyze all this aDNA data. So, as others such as Mark van der Linden or Martin Fuhrholt have argued before me, there's a lot we don't yet understand about prehistoric population dynamics. And in our motherhood project, we wanted to find out how many children a Bronze Age woman might have had and how likely she died of pregnancy and birth-related problems. So according to Poquet-Appel, the population growth rate and total fertility rate correlate with the proportion of subadults in any given population. The total fertility rate indicates how many children a woman had on average if she survived to the age of 50. So to calculate these indicators, one has to accept 2 assumptions. One is that the childbearing period lasted from 15 to 50, and the other that the life expectancy ranges somewhere between 20 and 30, which is usually assumed for the Bronze Age. And using data from 2 different Austrian cemeteries, early Bronze Age Unterhautzental and middle Bronze Age Pitten, we came to comparable results. So we had a growth rate of 1.4 and 1.2, and that translates into 7.9 or 7.5 children per woman. And if we then take the normal risk of dying today when nothing effective is done to avert death, it's estimated about 1.5 women die per birth. So then this adds up to a lifetime risk about 10 to 15% to die in pregnancy and childbirth. But the true mortality depends enormously on cultural factors such as medical knowledge, beliefs about hygiene, as well as the social status of women and their involvement in decision making. But let me now turn to patrilocal and what this might mean in terms of maternal and infant mortality. A larger proportion of women with non-local isotope signals than men are most often interpreted as indicating patrilocal residential rules, so the woman is moving into the man's household or village. Globally, patrilocality is widespread and was documented in about 70% of the world's cultures. And there's plenty of evidence for patrilocality from the LBK throughout the Bronze Age. High levels of movement, but not necessarily primarily by women, have also been documented in corded-ware cemeteries. I just want to show, because I'm not sure how widely known these results are, there was a study of 22 corded-ware and 8 bell-beaker individuals from Franzhausen, Lower Austria, that identified 6 non-locals in the corded-ware group. And they included 2 women and 3 or 4 men, depending on whether or not one believes in archaeological sex assignment. So in societies where patrilocal residence is the norm, maternal grandparents generally do not live in the same economic group. Now this might be a problem, because it has been demonstrated that the contribution of maternal grandmothers has a very beneficial effect on the survival of children, and the paternal grandparents have little or adverse effects. So we generally tend to underestimate the role of grandparents in societies who provide resources and care in the upbringing of children. And this gave me the opportunity to stick a picture of my mom and son in there and thank her for all the childcare. It has been argued that the contribution of grandmothers contributed to the evolution of longevity in women beyond the menopause, expanding on the idea that ceasing and reproduction early has its advantages in bringing existing children to maturity. And when we started to investigate motherhood at Unterhautsental, we first assumed that this 35 to 45-year-old woman buried with 2 children was indeed their mother. The younger child was placed facing her directly, and the a little bit older child was here snuggled behind the back. The head of the 2 individuals is covered by a ball. And then we were quite surprised to see that the children share the same haplotype and are probably very closely related, but the woman is not maternally related to them. So she was definitely not the mother, and because of the age gap, the paternal grandmother would be an option. And as we can see, she did not contribute very much to the upbringing of the children. Bronze Age women who came from communities farther away might not have had adequate help from their own mothers and maternal relatives when they gave birth. So the longer the distance from the birth family, the less likely they could have provided direct practical and economic support. And this might have contributed to a high maternal and infant mortality. On the other hand, the new mother's female relatives might travel to assist birth and help during the postpartum period, assuming the roles of midwives. So women might move back and forth between communities for this reason. And this also raises the question if women's identities are truly always fixed in one place. We could think of concepts such as multilocality, with individuals being rooted in multiple places and routinely move between places. So in the Bronze Age, there's plenty of material evidence of caring for babies and young children. A ceramic spoon at Pitten, for example, might have been used to feed a sick child, and Bronze Age feeding vessels, in which we now also found traces of milk, were perhaps used for weaning. And the last fun fact about patrilocality, with special thanks to Estella, who sent me the reference, patrilocality might also be a reason why there were so few female warriors. Evidence of female warriors is elusive in later prehistoric Europe, probably not because of the weakness or peacefulness, but because patrilocal exogamous marital residence systems stand in contradiction with women participating in war. So under these conditions, the wife is faced with contradictory loyalties during warfare because her husband may go to war against her brothers and father. It appears that women have been excluded historically from warfare in order to resolve this contradiction and protect the security of the warrior husbands. So I tried to Photoshop the beard out of this picture, but as you can see, I'm not very good at Photoshopping. So what do women do in Bronze Age societies apart from being mothers? There's now good evidence that we should actually spend a little bit more time rethinking gendered labor divisions and what that might mean for women's mobility. I will end by showing 2 recent examples from Bronze Age Austria. Ali Davish Zadeh investigated fingerprints on pottery from the early Bronze Age cemetery of Franzhausen and developed a methodology to investigate the age and gender distribution. And contrary to the common belief that women made all the pottery whilst doing other things around the house, the majority of these fingerprints could be linked to adult men and children. And meanwhile, at the cemetery of Geitzendorf, north of the Danube, a 45 to 60-year-old woman was buried with a toolkit linked to metalworking, including an anvil and 4 cushion stones. So such tools are quite rare in Bronze Age graves and often linked to male metal workers. But it's nice to think that women might have produced their own jewelry rather than having to rely on itinerant bronze smiths traveling by. So to conclude, I think it's fair to say that an ADNA and isotopes have brought exciting new data to interpret gender and family relations. And this is perhaps a more paleo-ethnographic anthropological approach than one that aims to write population history. And picking up on what Mario said yesterday about the potential misuse of archaeology and genetics in modern political context, I would also like to see a positive opportunity here. So the deep time perspective of prehistory, enriched with science-based data, lets us reflect on and discuss some social questions with relevance in our modern world, and in doing so, make archaeology relevant beyond our research community. And in terms of gendered power division, we can at least point out that the Bronze Age was probably not a model we should follow today. Thank you.